Yes, good afternoon, colleagues. I would like to thank all nations standing by Ukraine physically right now, and I have the honor to deliver a joint press stakeout on a decade since the beginning of Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine and 2 years of Russia's full-scale military invasion of Ukraine. I do it on behalf of the governments of Ukraine, Albania, Andorra, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Cyprus, Czechia, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, France, Georgia, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, Ireland, Japan, Italy, Latvia, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Malta, Marshall Islands, Federal States of Micronesia, Monaco, Montenegro, the Netherlands, New Zealand, North Macedonia, Norway, Palau, Paraguay, Poland, Portugal, Republic of Korea, Republic of Moldova, Romania, San Marino, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Uruguay, and the European Union. Today we mark a decade since the beginning of Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine on 19th February 2014, which started with its seizure of Crimea, and 2 years since the beginning of Russia's unprovoked, full-scale, and illegal invasion of Ukraine. We reiterate our resolute condemnation of this flagrant violation of international law. We deplore the Russian Federation's failure to implement the UN General Assembly resolutions adopted at its 11th Emergency Special Session. We also refer to the judgment of the International Court of Justice of 31st January 2024 that leaves no doubt that the Russian Federation is in violation of its international legal obligations. We also consider that the ICJ judgment of 2nd February 2024 is an important step towards holding Russia accountable for its violations of international law. We reiterate that the ICJ order on provisional measures of 16 March 2022 obliges Russia to immediately suspend the military operation that it commenced on 24 February 2022 in the territory of Ukraine, remains legally binding and must be implemented by the Russian Federation. We are appalled by Russian forces' attacks striking civilians and civilian infrastructure of Ukraine, which may constitute war crimes. We re-emphasize that indiscriminate attacks are prohibited by international humanitarian law. We also condemn continued military support for Russia's war of aggression, including by Iran, Belarus, and DPRK. We urge all countries not to provide weapons and to restrict exports of all items critical to the military to Russia for its war of aggression against Ukraine. Russia's continued procurement of arms and related material, including ballistic missiles, from DPRK places both in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. The Russian Federation's actions undermine the credibility of the Security Council and its resolutions, exacerbate regional tensions, and endanger us all. Today we gathered to reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Ukraine, pay tribute to all those who have sacrificed their lives in the defense of the freedom and independence of Ukraine, and express our deepest sympathy and condolences to the families of the victims of the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine. We demand from Russia to complete exchange of prisoners of war, as well as the release of all unlawfully detained persons and the return of all internees and of civilians forcibly transferred or deported, including children. We will continue working on ensuring accountability for serious crimes under international law committed on the territory of Ukraine during the Russian aggression. We reiterate our demand to Russia to stop its war of aggression against Ukraine and to ensure the full, immediate, and unconditional withdrawal of all Russian forces and military equipment from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. We remain committed to the vision of a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace for Ukraine in line with the principles of the UN Charter. In this regard, we are encouraged by the meeting of national security advisors and foreign policy advisors on the implementation of the peace formula in Davos, where the key principles of achieving the peace for Ukraine were discussed. Representatives of more than 80 states and international organizations took part in this meeting. We express our joint support for inaugural Global Peace Summit. We reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, extending to its territorial waters. I conclude the joint press stakeout, and I would like to again thank everyone for supporting Ukraine in during these 2 years. We are strong, we are united, we are resolved, and we will deliver. Thank you.
Thank you.
This concludes our joint press stakeout. Thank you. Let's proceed to the meeting.
Bravo.
So yeah, no, I flew it overnight too. You're close to home now. So I got another flight home tonight. 2 nights on a plane in a row. Yeah. Ideas for how you do it.
The 9,557th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. There's a point of order. I give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, хотел бы сказать несколько слов по порядку ведения
I
заседания.
wanted to say a few words on a point of order.
Мы с вами находимся в переполненном
We
зале.
are in a room that is full.
Переполнен не только зал,
The room is
но и
not only
список
full,
выступающих
but
не
the
членов Совета
list
Безопасности,
of
которые именуют себя
speakers who are
министрами
not
иностранных
members of
дел
the Security Council who call themselves
европейских
ministers of foreign affairs of European
в
countries.
ЕС, за редким исключением, нет
European
самостоятельной
Union,
страновой внешней политики.
except for some
Соответственно, нет и
few
министра
exclusions,
иностранных дел.
does not have an independent
А есть чиновники, выдающие себя за
foreign
таковых.
policy. There are no ministers of
Вся
foreign
внешняя
affairs. There are
политика
simply
Евросоюза
officials who
находится в руках Брюсселя,
claim that they are foreign
а
ministers.
Брюссель, в свою очередь, находится
Foreign
в
policy
руках
is in the hands
Вашингтона.
of Brussels, while Brussels is
Ответьте
in the
мне на
hands of
риторический вопрос.
Washington. So maybe you can answer a
Какую
rhetorical
добавленную
question. What
стоимость
is the added value?
будут иметь
What is the added
написанные под
value
копирку
of
выступления этих
statements by
чиновников,
officials that were
кроме возможности
written under
покрасоваться на
dictation,
телекранах
other
своих
than an
стран,
opportunity
выражая
to
безоговорочно
show themselves off on the
непоколебимую
television of their
поддержку
countries
своим
while stating their unconditional, unstinting support for their Kiev clients.
В Нью-Йорке есть представитель ЕС.
In New York, we have a representative of the EU with the UN. He could have spoken on behalf of everyone. The EU has a common foreign policy and common security policy. What could you possibly add to that?
Ну, расскажите тогда уж о
Maybe you
поставляемом вами
can tell
оружии
us about
преступному
the
киевскому
weapons
режиму,
that you're
которым он
supplying to the
обстреливает не
criminal
военные
Kiev
цели,
regime, which
а
it uses
мирное
not to
гражданское население
target
российских
military
городов.
facilities, but rather peaceful civilians in Russian cities.
А представитель Великобритании пусть нам поведает, как
Representative
его
of
бывший
the
премьер
United
Борис
Kingdom could tell
Джонсон
us
отговорил
maybe how
киевские
his
власти
former Prime
заключить
Minister Boris
уже
Johnson
парафированное в
dissuaded the
апреле
Kiev
22 года
authorities
мирное
to
соглашение с Россией
conclude an
вдохновить Киев
agreement in April
продолжать
2022 that
боевые
had
действия и
already been
обречь на
initialed,
смерть
an agreement
десятки
with
тысяч
Russia,
несчастных
thus
украинцев,
encouraging
брошенных
Kiev to
на фронт в
continue
качестве
fighting and
пушечного
condemning
мяса.
to death tens of thousands of Ukrainians who were then thrown into the
Кстати,
front
где вы
as
все были
cannon
вчера,
fodder.
когда
And
Совет
by the way, where
обсуждал
were all of you
ближневосточное
yesterday when
регулирование
the
и
Council
ситуацию в Газе?
yesterday was discussing the
Где,
Middle
кстати,
Eastern
был
peace
генеральный
process and the
секретарь ООН?
situation in Gaza? Where was the
Хочу
Secretary
напомнить,
General?
что
I
ни
just
одна
want to
из стран
remind
Евросоюза
everyone that not a single
вообще
European
Запада
Union country,
ни разу не
in fact, not a
выступила с
single Western
инициативой
country, not a
созыва
single
хотя бы
time
одного, ни разу
put
хотя бы
forward an
одного заседания
initiative to
по Газе,
convene even one, just one meeting on Gaza.
где число жертв
In
гражданского
Gaza, the
населения
number
в
of
результате вопиющих
victims among the
нарушений
civilian
международного
population as a
гуманитарного права
result
со
of
стороны
blatant
Израиля
violations of
за
international
4,5
humanitarian law by
месяца,
Israel over
большинство из
the past
которых
4.5
женщины и
months,
дети,
most of them are
превысило
women and
показатели
children,
любых
has
военных
far
конфликтов
exceeded the
последних.
numbers of military conflicts that have occurred
Это
over the
более
past
чем
few years.
красноречиво говорит
This
о
is
вашем лицемерии
more
и
than
двойных
eloquently
стандартах.
speaks to your hypocrisy and double
Хочу заранее
standards.
предупредить, я
I
не буду
want
слушать
to
ритуальные заклинания
warn you
представителей
in advance
европейских
that I
правительств.
don't intend to listen to
Пусть
the
они
ritual
упражняются в
mantras
своем
of
красноречии
representatives
друг
of
перед
European
другом,
states.
засоряя
They can
эфир
practice
своими
their
лицемерными
eloquence in front of each other,
Благодарю.
clogging the airwaves with their
I
hypocritical
take note of
statements.
the statement of the Russian Federation. I would like to warmly welcome the Secretary General, distinguished ministers, and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Croatia, Germany, Lithuania, Luxembourg, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, North Macedonia, Poland, Portugal, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Madam President, Excellencies, the United Nations Charter and international law are our guides to creating a world free from the scourge of war. Yet, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine directly violated both. 2 years on, and a decade since Russia's attempted illegal annexation of Ukraine's autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, the war in Ukraine remains an open wound at the heart of Europe. It is high time for peace, a just peace based on the United Nations Charter, international law, and General Assembly resolutions. Madam President, the Charter is unequivocal. The United Nations is based on the principle of sovereign equality of all its members. International disputes should be settled by peaceful means, and all states shall refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state. Mechanisms to settle disputes are set out in Chapter 6 of the Charter. They include negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, and resort to regional agencies or arrangements. These must be the tools we use to settle grievances. Madam President, our world is at a chaotic moment. Following the Cold War and then a period of unipolarity, we are now making a turbulent transition to a as yet uncertain multipolar world. Power relations are unclear, creating a sense of instability and impunity. All borders are the result of history. Many communities are divided by those borders. Many people living on one side have strong ethnic, cultural, or other links to communities on the other side. Can we afford to address different interpretations of history which are so widespread around the world through war? We must pay tribute to the wisdom of African leaders and follow their example. Colonial powers, including my own country, divided the continent of Africa with the stroke of a pen as they did in other parts of the world. But post-independence leaders understood that trying to change borders would open a Pandora's box of bloodshed and feed even greater grievances. In my experience, it's extremely difficult for people to agree on the past. What is more important and less difficult is to help them agree on the future. And to agree on the future, international law and the principles set out in the UN Charter, including respect for territorial integrity and the political independence of states, are fundamental. This is why the Russian invasion of Ukraine is such a dangerous precedent. Madam President, in any war, everyone suffers. But the people of Ukraine are suffering appallingly from the war inflicted on them by Russia. Over 10,500 civilian men, women, and children have been killed, though the true figure is likely higher. Damage and destruction of hospitals, schools, health facilities, and civilian infrastructure is frequent and intensifying. 90 education and healthcare facilities were damaged or destroyed in January alone. And amidst the brutal winter, over 380 towns and villages across the country were without electricity early this month, according to the Ukrainian Energy Company. The United Nations has documented widespread and disturbing brutality. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine reported civilians and prisoners tortured and more than 200 cases of sexual violence, mostly, but not only, at the hands of the Russian Federation forces. All perpetrators must be held to account. Many Ukrainians are experiencing the living nightmare of losing their children. All children that have been deported must be reunited with their families. Nearly 4 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced, including almost 1 million children. And over 14.5 million people inside the country need humanitarian assistance. Humanitarian aid programs carried out by the United Nations and our partners, particularly our Ukrainian partners, reached 11 million people last year. That included providing life-saving food, water, healthcare, and shelter, as well as working to remove the deadly explosives that litter the Ukrainian landscape. Yet, access to around 1.5 million people is extremely restricted. That must change. attacks against humanitarians and civilian infrastructure must stop. And I urge donors to fund in full the $3.1 billion appeal to put our Ukrainian humanitarian response plan into practice and so that we can continue our vital work. Madame la Présidente,
Madam President,
la guerre fait également du mal à la
the
population
war
russe.
is also hurting the
Des
people of
milliers de
Russia.
jeunes Russes ont trouvé la
Thousands
mort
of
sur
young
le front.
Russians are dying on the
Les
front
civils
lines.
touchés par les frappes sur les villes
Civilians
russes
hit by
souffrent aussi.
strikes on Russian cities
Le
are also
risque que le
suffering.
conflit s'aggrave
The
et se
danger of the
répand est
conflict
bien réel.
escalating and expanding is
Dans le monde
very
entier,
real. And
la
around
guerre
the world,
accentue les clivages
the war is
géopolitiques.
deepening
Elle
geopolitical divides.
attise l'instabilité
It
régionale.
is fanning
Elle
regional
réduit l'espace
instability
disponible pour
and
traiter d'autres
shrinking the
problèmes
space
mondiaux
available to
urgents
address other
et elle
urgent
sape les normes
global
et les valeurs
issues.
communes
And it
qui
is
contribuent à
undermining
notre
the shared
sécurité
norms
à
and values
tous.
that make us all safer.
Le conflit a accéléré une
The
flambée de
conflict
prix alimentaires,
accelerated
de
the
chocs
surge in
économiques
food
et une crise
prices,
mondiale du coût
economic
de la
shocks,
vie,
and a global cost
frappant
of
de plein
living
fouet les
crisis,
pays en
hitting
développement qui
developing
sont encore
countries
en train de se
still
relever du
recovering from
Covid-19.
COVID-19 the
En
hardest.
outre, la
In
possibilité que
addition,
cette guerre
the
entraîne un
prospect
accident
of this war
nucléaire glace
resulting
le
in
sang du
nuclear
monde
accident
entier.
chills
Les
spines
deux
around the
parties au
world.
conflit doivent prendre
Both
toutes les
sides
mesures
to the
possibles
conflict
pour
must
empêcher
take all
cela,
possible measures
et
to
ce, sur
prevent
tous les
that
sites
from
nucléaires
happening
du pays.
at all nuclear sites
L'Agence
across the country.
internationale de l'énergie
The
atomique
International Atomic
continuera de
Energy
soutenir
Agency
ces
will
efforts.
continue to support these
Nous
efforts.
continuerons également à
And we
pousser
will
en
also
faveur de la
keep
liberté
pushing
et de la sûreté de
for
la
freedom and
navigation en
safety
mer
of
Noire
navigation in the Black
et que les
Sea,
denrées alimentaires
and
et
that
les
badly
engrais ukrainiens
needed
et russes
Ukrainian and
dont
Russian
le monde
food
a
and
tant besoin
fertilizers
puissent
reach
attendre le
the global
marché
market
international sans restriction.
without restrictions.
Madame la Présidente, Excellences,
Madam
depuis
President,
l'invasion à grande échelle de
Excellencies,
l'Ukraine par la
since
Russie,
Russia's
nous avons
full-scale
connu 2
invasion
années
of
de
Ukraine,
combat,
we have
2
had
années
2
de
years of
souffrance,
fighting, 2
des années
years of
auxquelles
suffering,
les tensions
2
mondiales ont
years
été
of stoking
attisées
global
et les
tensions
relations
and
internationales mises à
straining
mal.
global relations.
C'en est assez.
Enough.
Le mépris de la charte était à
Scorning
l'origine
the
du
Charter
problème.
has been the
Le
problem.
respecter en est la
Honoring
solution.
it is the solution.
Cela veut dire respecter la
That
souveraineté,
means
l'indépendance,
honoring the
l'unité et
sovereignty,
l'intégrité
independence,
territoriale
unity,
de
and territorial
l'Ukraine
integrity of
dans ses
Ukraine
frontières internationalement
within its
reconnues.
internationally recognized
Il est temps de
borders.
réaffirmer notre
It is
attachement à la
time to
charte
recommit to the
et
Charter
de faire preuve d'un
and
respect
to renew
renouvelé
respect
pour le droit
for international
international.
law.
Telle est la voie de la paix et de
That
la
is the path to
sécurité
peace and
en
security
Ukraine et dans
in
le monde
Ukraine
entier. Et je
and
vous
around the
remercie.
world. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Council. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Tanja Fajon, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would also like to thank the Secretary General for his, as always, lucid, frank and insightful briefing. Madam President, it has been 2 years of death and destruction for Ukraine and its people. 2 years of international humanitarian law violations. 2 years of human rights violations. 2 years of aggression. To add to this grim picture, this week also marks 10 years since the illegal annexation of Crimea. While being aware of repetitiveness, I want to seize the opportunity of sitting in this chamber, representing a UN Security Council member, to condemn once again the Russian aggression against Ukraine in blatant violation of the UN Charter and Helsinki Final Act on inviolability of borders in Europe. Slovenia expresses full support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. While Ukraine has been attacked with artillery shells, drones, and ballistic missiles, the rest of the world has been attacked with narratives, particularly on how this war started and why it was inevitable to start. Let me provide you with our own perspective, a perspective of a country committed to peace and peaceful settlement of international disputes. A perspective from the Security Council member from the region that is being destabilized by the war. My country believes that Russia is displaying a complete disregard for the UN Charter. just as it is displaying a complete disregard for the vast corpus of international law and key agreements that provided for European and international stability and security. It is resulting in lives being lost, families being torn apart, and infrastructure being destroyed. And there is no alternative story that can be told. No compelling additional narrative to be shared, just a story of death and destruction. Regardless of our vicinity, we did not see this war coming. To be more exact, we refused to believe that it was coming, that a major war on our doorstep was possible. A war which would so blatantly violate borders of a sovereign state, destabilizing the whole region and changing the global geopolitical landscape. Yet 2 years into this senseless war, we are not accepting it and are most definitely not accepting the demands of the occupying Russian forces. We are not tired of calling this aggression out and of demanding it to stop. We will spare no effort in pursuing full accountability for the long list of atrocities and other international crimes. Madam President, Slovenia applauds the Ukrainian nation for its bravery and resolute defense of their motherland. We share their vision of a just, lasting, and sustainable peace, and we join in the collective efforts in this regard. Such peace is worth believing in and acting on, and we will continue to stand by Ukraine until we reach that point. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Fajon, for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Stéphane Séjourné, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France.
Merci Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le Secrétaire Général.
Thank you
Cela
very
fait
much, Madam
2 ans
President,
que la
distinguished
Russie
Secretary
mène une
General.
guerre d'agression
For 2 years now,
à
Russia has
grande
carried
échelle
out a
contre
large-scale
l'Ukraine
war of aggression
et
against
contre le
Ukraine
peuple
and against the
ukrainien.
Ukrainian people.
Une guerre d'agression
This
injuste,
is an unjust,
injustifiable
unjustifiable,
et illégale.
and illegal war of
Au
aggression.
total, cela
In
fait
total,
10
it has now
mois, 10
been
ans que
10
la
years
Russie cherche à
that
envahir
Russia
son
has
voisin
sought to
et
invade its neighbor
veut lui prendre une partie de
and
son
to
territoire.
take a part of its
Ni les
territory
mauvais
from
prétextes
that
déployés par
neighbor.
la Russie, ni
Neither
la
the poor
propagande
pretext
et la
used by
désinformation
Russia,
massive
nor
sur
the
les réseaux
propaganda or the
sociaux ne
massive
résistent à ce
misinformation on
constat
social
clair et
networks
sans appel.
can
La
deny
Russie
this
continue d'agresser
obvious
son
and
voisin,
crystal
des
clear
troupes
fact.
russes
Russia
sont
continues
présentes
to
sur le
attack its
territoire
neighbor. There are
ukrainien.
Russian troops on
L'État
Ukrainian
souverain,
territory.
l'Ukraine, un
A
État souverain.
sovereign state. Ukraine is a
La
sovereign
Russie a
state.
fait seule le choix de la guerre
Russia
qu'elle a
alone
décidé de mener
has
depuis
opted for
2
war,
ans,
a war that it
dont
has been
elle
carrying
porte
out for
seule
2
la
years,
responsabilité.
and Russia alone
La
bears the
Russie pourrait
responsibility.
choisir d'y mettre
Russia
un terme en
could
retirant ses
decide
troupes du
to
territoire
end
ukrainien,
that war by
mais elle
withdrawing
ne le
its
fait pas.
troops from Ukrainian
Au
territory, but it
contraire,
does
elle
not do
continue
that.
de
On the
mener une
contrary,
guerre
it
dont les
continues to
conséquences
carry out this war
font souffrir beaucoup de
whose
populations,
consequences
nos
have
populations,
caused suffering
celles
for many people,
des
for
pays
our
les plus
people.
vulnérables, celles
I'm
qui
thinking of the
souffrent
most
le plus
vulnerable
de la crise alimentaire,
countries
de la crise
which
énergétique
suffer
également.
most from the
Cette
food and
guerre,
energy
je le disais,
crisis.
elle est illégale et
This war
en tout point
is
contraire à
illegal
la Charte
and
des
it
Nations
runs
Unies,
counter to the
aux
UN
règles et aux
Charter,
principes qui
to
fondent
the
l'ordre
rules and
international
principles
que nous avons
underpinning
bâti au
international
sortir
order
de
which
la Deuxième
we
Guerre mondiale.
built
Un
after
ordre
the Second
dont
World
notre
War.
Conseil doit rester d'ailleurs le garant,
Our
comme
Council must
le respect
continue
de sa
to
souveraineté
uphold this
également,
order
de l'indépendance et de l'intégrité
and
territoriale
ensure
des
respect
États.
for the sovereignty, independence,
Nous ne pouvons
territorial
pas, nous
integrity
ne
of
devons
states.
pas
We
y
cannot,
renoncer.
we must
Nous
not
devons
shirk that
faire
duty.
primer et
We must
respecter le
ensure
droit.
that law
Je vous
prevails
remercie
and
d'ailleurs,
is
Monsieur le
respectable.
Secrétaire
And thank you
général,
very
de
much,
rappeler
distinguished
très clairement
Secretary General, for
ces
reminding us
principes dans votre
quite
intervention.
clearly about those
La Russie
principles in your
viole
statement.
les principes de la Charte,
Russia
mais
is
aussi
violating the principles
les
of the Charter,
résolutions
but
adoptées
also
par notre
resolutions
Conseil.
adopted by our
Elle
Council.
utilise aussi
It
pour
does so
mener ses frappes des drones
in order
acquis
to
en
carry
Iran
out
et des missiles
strikes. It
fournis
has
par la Corée du
purchased
Nord.
drones
Elle
from
occupe
Iran,
illégalement
missiles
la
from North
centrale
Korea. It is
de nucléaire
illegally
de
occupying
Zaporizhzhia
the Zaporizhzhia
et
nuclear
n'hésite
power
pas à miner
plant, and it
ses
does not
abords.
hesitate to mine the
Cela
surrounding
accroît de
area.
manière irresponsable d'ailleurs
And this
le
has
risque
led to
d'incidents et d'accidents nucléaires.
irresponsibly
entrave
led
la
to an
liberté de
increased
circulation en mer Noire,
risk
elle
of a
utilise
nuclear accident.
l'énergie et
It also
l'alimentation comme
impedes the
des
free
armes de guerre
circulation
et de
of
coercition. Elle emploie la désinformation.
in the Black Sea.
Et là, monsieur le représentant
war
de la
of
Fédération
Russia
de Russie,
is
je ne peux pas vous
illegal.
laisser dire que les ministres ne se sont pas
I
réunis
will not
sur
allow you to
Gaza. J'ai
say that
moi-même
ministers
présidé au
do
niveau
not
ministériel
stand together
une
with regard to
réunion
Gaza. I
hebdomadaire
myself
sur
held
ce
a
point-là, en présence
weekly meeting
de nombreux
on
ministres
that
de
matter
l'Union
in the
européenne.
presence of many European ministers.
La guerre de la Russie est illégale
Russia's
aussi
war is
parce
also
que ses
illegal
troupes
because
violent
its
massivement le
troops
droit
are
international
committing massive
humanitaire
violations of
et
international
les droits de
humanitarian
l'homme.
law
Illégale, la
and human
guerre
rights
russe
law.
l'est aussi
The Russian war
inhumaine.
is illegal as well because it is cruel, inhuman. And again, I repeat our firmest condemnation for the massacre of civilians, the rapes and the torture used as weapons of war, as well as the deportation of Ukrainian children. These crimes must not go unpunished. And that ultimately is the thrust of the 2 arrest warrants issued by the ICC last year. And Russia would like us
Elle
to
veut
forget
nous
that as
persuader
well.
de ses victoires
It wants to persuade
inéluctables
us of
et elle
its
veut que
victories
nous renoncions
and it
à
wants
défendre
us
notre sécurité et nos
to
valeurs.
stop
Elle échouera sur
standing
ce terrain et
for
sur
and
d'autres.
upholding our
D'abord,
security,
la Russie
security
est en échec sur le point militaire
in
et sur le point
Ukraine,
de
but
vue militaire.
Russia is
Après
failing
2
on the
ans de
military and
pertes
political front after 2
immenses
years
au
of
prix
enormous
de pertes
losses,
humaines par centaines de
enormous
milliers,
human
au prix d'une
losses,
répression interne sans merci contre les
relentless
voix qui
domestic
disent l'absurdité
repression
de cette
against
guerre,
people
au
who
prix
say
d'une
how
économie en
absurd
déclin
this war
malgré des
is,
statistiques faussées.
and a failing
Elle
economy
stagne
despite
sur
the
le
trumped
terrain
up
militaire et recule
statistics,
en mer Noire.
and
Elle échouera aussi
it
à
will
nous
also
décourager. Dès
fail
lundi, la
to
France
discourage
réunira
us.
autour du président de la
France will
République
meet with the President of
les
the
pays
Republic
déterminés à
and
accroître
countries
le
determined
soutien à
to
l'Ukraine
increase
et à
support to
répondre à la
Ukraine
menace que la
and
Russie
to
fait
respond
peser sur leur
to
sécurité.
Russia's threat to that
Solidarité,
country's
nous
security.
sommes donc
We
pleinement
stand together
mobilisés
and
pour
we are fully
l'Ukraine. L'Ukraine
mobilized
exerce sa
in support
légitime
of
défense.
Ukraine,
Elle
which is
défend
calling for its
son
legitimate
existence
defense,
même et
is
sa
fighting for its
liberté,
very survival,
notamment face
for its freedom
à l'envahisseur.
vis-à-vis the
Et pourtant,
invader,
l'Ukraine
and
seule
yet
cherche
Ukraine
la paix
alone is seeking
et
peace.
propose des initiatives
It
en
has
ce sens avec
proposed
le plan du
initiatives
président
to that
Zelensky.
end, along
La
with
France et
President
l'Europe
Zelensky's
continueront
plan. France and Europe
unis
will continue
à
to stand
soutenir là
united
aussi ce
and
plan
to
de soutien
support
et de ce plan
that
de paix
plan of
que
peace,
propose le
that plan
président
of support
Zelensky. Voilà,
proposed
Monsieur
by
le
President
secrétaire
Zelensky.
général, Madame la
Distinguished
Présidente,
Secretary
notre
General,
Conseil
Madam
doit
President,
être
our
uni
Council
autour
must
d'un
stand
objectif
united
que notre
with one
charte
goal in
s'impose
mind.
partout, à tous.
Under our charter,
Dans cette
the
guerre, c'est la victoire de notre charte qu'il faut
victory of our
rechercher
charter
par
in the
la
face
mise
of
en
this
échec
war
de la Russie. Je vous
is
remercie.
what we must stand for. Thank you.
His Excellency, Mr. Séjourné, for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Lord David Cameron, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Madam President and Mr. Secretary General. We meet 2 years since Vladimir Putin ordered a wholly unprovoked invasion of a sovereign member of the United Nations. Airstrikes at dawn, tanks rolling across the border, preposterous claims that this was not a declaration of war. And in many ways, the most remarkable thing was the total lack of any justification whatsoever, or of any threat from Ukraine. The abject disregard for the laws that bind nations and for the principles of this United Nations. The brazenness with which Putin still claimed this was somehow legitimate. Days after February the 24th, the United Nations General Assembly declared that the invasion was wrong and that Russia must withdraw immediately. 2 years on, this has not changed. And so today I want to pose 2 questions. My first to the Kremlin. My first visit as Foreign Secretary was to Ukraine. I stood in the wreckage of Odessa's bombed-out cathedral. I saw brave Ukrainians kissing loved ones goodbye as they left to defend their homeland. And I know that such scenes are not limited to Ukraine. Russian mothers, too, have had to bid farewell to Russian sons. Russian cities, too, now bear the scars of war. So my question to Putin is simple. Why? His government claims this to be a battle between brothers. What twisted form of brotherhood is this for which so many lives must be ruined. How is Russia living up to its responsibilities as a permanent member of this Council to uphold international peace and security? And how many ridiculous explanations have we now had for this invasion? Are they criminals or are they fellow Russians? One minute Ukraine is an existential threat, the next we're told it doesn't exist. Are you fighting stooges of NATO or Nazis? The only people behaving like Nazis are the Putin regime, invading another country and hoping the world will be weak and let you get away with it. That is the simple truth. Putin believes he can take territories, redraw borders, exercise force to build his empire, and we must not let this stand. We know Ukraine's answer. We saw the courage of President Zelensky 2 years ago. And I say to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation, he is quite capable, and the Ukrainian people are quite capable of making up their own mind about whether they should surrender part of their country to your illegal invasion. And today we admire the perseverance of the Ukrainian people day in, day out. They won't falter. Indeed, they're continuing to push Russia back, liberating half the land Putin seized and driving the Russian Navy out of its base in Sevastopol. The course of the war may ebb and flow, but the seizure of a small town does not change the reality of Russia's situation. The Russian military is being drained of its modern equipment. You're having to rely on poor quality shells from Pyongyang. And you sent a generation of Russian boys into the meat grinder. What do you tell their mothers they died for? Or don't you even bother? The Kremlin expected Ukraine to fold, but they are standing firm for their freedom. And you should all know Britain's answer as well. Last month, the Prime Minister was the first foreign leader to address the Rada. We are the first country to have signed a security pact with Ukraine. And yesterday, we imposed further sanctions, clamping down on Russia's military-industrial complex and those enablers seeking to keep it running. These sanctions are a reminder. We won't falter. We will stand firm for Ukraine's freedom. And the world has also seen Alexei Navalny's answer. He showed incredible courage in returning to Russia. He didn't falter, and he has now suffered terrible consequences for standing firm for Russian democracy. And today is an opportunity, Secretary General, to give the world's answer. All of us abhor needless suffering. None of us have escaped the economic consequences of the war. And yet we all know what is at stake here. In acting so brazenly, Putin is not only trying to seize a chunk of his neighbor's territory, he is not only trying to extinguish the Ukrainian people's right to self-determination, he is openly trying to upset the international order, replacing it not with some progressive vision of equality of nations, but with a return to a 19th century ideology where might, particularly his might, is right. That is why we must all stand up to Putin, not just out of sympathy to Ukraine, but because his actions in Ukraine are so dangerous for everyone else. If we give in to the idea that one country can invade another with impunity, then we will be left in a dreadful situation where any country could face a similar fate. Respect for sovereignty lies at the heart of the international system, at the heart of the United Nations. Nothing matters more to its members than having our borders treated as inviolable. And that's why nothing should matter more to us than seeing Putin fail. We must not falter. We must stand firm. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Lord Cameron for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam President.
Notre organisation a été fondée sur
Our
la recherche
organization
de la
was
paix.
founded on the pursuit of
La paix
peace.
est notre raison d'être.
Peace is our raison d'être.
Monsieur le Secrétaire général,
Distinguished
permettez-moi
Secretary
d'utiliser
General,
aujourd'hui les mots
allow
que
me today to
vous
use
avez
the words
prononcés
which you
au
spoke
début du mois devant
earlier
l'Assemblée
this
générale
month
des
to
Nations
the
Unies.
UN General Assembly.
La paix est notre raison
Peace
d'être.
is our raison d'être.
La Suisse partage profondément cette vision.
Switzerland wholeheartedly
Le slogan
shares
de
this
notre
vision.
candidature au Conseil de
The
sécurité
slogan of
résonne
our
ainsi
candidacy for the Security Council thus
un
resonates.
plus pour la paix,
Un plus
a
pour la
plus
paix.
for peace.
A plus for peace.
Ce plus symbolise
This
également la
plus
croix blanche
also
au
symbolizes
cœur de
the
notre
white
drapeau
cross
rouge.
at the heart of our red
incarnant
flag,
notre engagement constant
embodying our constant
envers la
commitment
construction et le
to
maintien de la paix
building
dans le
and
monde.
maintaining peace in the world.
Chers collègues,
Dear colleagues,
malheureusement, au cours des 2 dernières
unfortunately,
années,
over the past
le
2
Conseil de
years,
sécurité n'a pas pleinement
the
assumé
Security
sa
Council has not
responsabilité
fully assumed
dans
its
la garantie de la paix et de
responsibility
la sécurité
to
pour
guarantee
l'Ukraine
peace and
et son
security
peuple.
for Ukraine and its people.
Nous avons, bien sûr,
Of course,
incessamment
we
lancé
have
des appels
tirelessly
à la paix,
called for
à
peace,
respecter le droit humanitaire international
for respect,
et à
of
redoubler
international
d'efforts pour mettre fin à
humanitarian
ce
law,
conflit.
and we have redoubled efforts
Et
to put an end
aujourd'hui,
to this conflict. And today,
Aujourd'hui, les pertes humaines
Today,
se chiffrent par
the
milliers.
loss of life runs
Les
into the
personnes
thousands,
déplacées se comptent par
the
millions
displaced number in the millions,
et les familles déchirées
and
ne
the
se comptent
families
plus.
torn apart are countless.
Les répercussions, tant en Europe
The
que dans le
repercussions,
monde,
both in
sont
Europe
désormais
and worldwide,
évidentes
are
sur
now obvious
les plans alimentaires,
in terms of
énergétiques,
food,
sécuritaires et ainsi de
energy,
suite.
security, and so on.
Alors, chers collègues,
And so,
que
dear
pouvons-nous
colleagues,
faire?
what can we do?
et surtout, que faisons-nous
And above all, what
Que
do we
faisons-nous
do? What are we
pour que la
doing
Charte des Nations Unies
to ensure
soit respectée?
that the UN Charter is respected?
Que faisons-nous pour que les
What are
conventions
we
de
doing
Genève
to
cessent
ensure
d'être
that the
violées?
Geneva Conventions are no longer violated?
Que faisons-nous pour que
What are we
l'humanité dans la
doing
guerre
to ensure that humanity in
et
war
pour
is
que la paix
assured
soit rétablie?
and that peace will be
Une
restored?
chose est certaine,
One thing is
malgré,
certain.
malgré toute la
Despite
frustration engendrée par cette
All the
guerre,
frustration caused by
voire
this
par
war,
toutes les guerres,
indeed
nous ne
by
devons
all
pas
wars,
céder au pessimisme.
we must not give in to pessimism.
Nous devons plutôt analyser et agir en
Instead,
fonction
we
des
need
faits
to analyze and
pour
act
trouver
on
tout
the facts
chemin menant vers la
to
paix.
find any path to peace.
À la lumière de notre histoire de
In the light of
Nations
our history
Unies.
as United Nations.
Madame la Présidente,
Madam
Excellence,
President,
dans cette
Excellencies,
salle,
in this room,
nous sommes les gardiens de la paix.
We
Nous
are the
portons
guardians
ensemble
of
la
peace.
responsabilité de cet idéal.
and therefore together
décidé
we
il y a
bear the
3/4 de siècle.
responsibility for this ideal decided
Nous
3/4 of a
devons
century
parvenir
ago.
à faire ensemble
We must
un premier
succeed
pas sur ce
in
chemin.
taking the first step on
Car
this
la
path
cause de la
together,
paix est trop grande
because the
pour
cause of
permettre à
peace
nos
is too
différences
great
de nous bloquer.
to allow our differences to hold us back.
En janvier dernier, au marge
Last
du World Economic
January, on
Forum
the
de Davos en
sidelines of the
Suisse
World Economic Forum
et à
in
la
Davos,
demande de
Switzerland,
l'Ukraine,
and at Ukraine's
la Suisse a
request,
exprimé son engagement à
Switzerland
organiser une
expressed its commitment
conférence de haut niveau
to
sur la paix en
organizing
Ukraine.
a high-level conference on peace in Ukraine.
Nous sommes parfaitement conscients de la
We are
complexité de
fully
cette
aware of the
mission,
complexity of this mission,
de la sinuosité du parcours
the sinuosity of the
l'incertitude
path,
de
and the
l'horizon.
uncertainty of the horizon.
Mais nous travaillons sans relâche
But
pour
we are
initier
working
une dynamique à la
tirelessly
fois
to create a
pragmatique
dynamic
et inclusive.
that is both pragmatic and
Je
inclusive.
suis en effet convaincu qu'il faut écouter
Indeed, I'm
tout le
convinced
monde,
that we need to listen to
comprendre les
everyone
grammaires de la paix
to
des uns
understand each other's
et des autres.
grammar of peace.
Et l'horizon incertain deviendra de
And
plus
the
en plus
uncertain
certain
horizon will become more and
grâce à
more
une large
certain
alliance de toutes les
thanks
régions
to
du
a
monde.
broad alliance of all regions of the world.
Et les parcours sinueux
And the winding
deviendront
road
moins sinueux
will become less
si nous
winding
évitons les pièges de la
if we avoid
rhétorique
the
qui
pitfalls
alimente les
of the
oppositions.
rhetoric that fuels opposition.
Mesdames et messieurs, je
Ladies
vous
and
invite à
gentlemen,
entreprendre ce
I
premier pas,
invite you to take that first
à
step,
nous lever
to stand up
aujourd'hui
today
pour marcher ensemble
and
vers
to
la
walk
paix.
together towards
Bien
peace.
sûr, la
Of
Suisse
course,
n'est ni la première
Switzerland
ni la
is
seule
neither
à
the
vouloir
first
agir.
nor the only country to
D'autres
take
pays se sont
action.
également engagés
Other
et je
countries
salue ici
are
leurs
also
initiatives.
committed, and I welcome their
Mais le temps
initiatives.
nous est compté.
But time is running out.
Unissons nos forces pour démarrer
Let's
un
join
processus
forces
avant l'été.
to start a process
La
before
Suisse
the
est prête
summer.
à y mettre toute
Switzerland is
son énergie.
prepared to put all its
Même
energy
si la
into
demande
it.
vient d'une seule partie,
Even
l'Ukraine,
if the request comes
et
from
alors
only
que mon
one
pays
party,
condamne
Ukraine, and
l'agression
while my
militaire
country
russe,
condemns Russian military
c'est
aggression,
aujourd'hui notre effort collectif.
it is our collective
est demandé.
effort that is being called
La
upon
paix
today.
est dans cette salle
Peace
notre
in this
raison d'être.
room is our raison
Une
d'être.
conférence de haut niveau sur la paix
A
en
high-level
Ukraine
conference
est un
on peace in
premier
Ukraine
pas,
is a first step,
insuffisant
insufficient on
à
its
lui
own,
seul, mais indispensable pour
indispensable
commencer.
as a starting point.
D'autres nations pourront également prendre la relève
I'm
J'en
sure
suis
other
persuadé.
nations will be able to follow
Il s'agit
suit.
maintenant de commencer avec
Now we need to
pragmatisme,
start with
avec
pragmatism
réalisme.
and with realism.
Pragmatisme pour trouver le
Pragmatism
dénominateur
to find
commun
the common denominator
de nos nations.
for our nations.
Réalisme
Realism
pour trouver le moyen
to
d'embarquer
find a
à
way
terme
of
l'Ukraine
eventually
et la Russie
bringing
sur ce
Ukraine
chemin.
and Russia on board.
Pour préparer la paix demain,
To prepare for
j'espère
peace
pouvoir
tomorrow,
compter
I hope
sur
I can
vous
count on you
aujourd'hui.
today.
Notre raison
Our
d'être
raison
en
d'être
dépend.
depends
Je
on
vous
it.
remercie.
I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Cassis for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Cho Tae-yul, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea.
Madam President, I wish to thank Guyana for convening this meeting. I also extend my appreciation to Secretary General Guterres for his insightful yet sadly troubling briefing. Indeed, it feels almost surreal to be in the very chamber which bears primary responsibility for international peace and security to address the unlawful aggression of one of its permanent members. 2 years since Russian tanks crossed over into Ukraine, violating the most sacrosanct tenet of the UN Charter, we see no signs of Russia's unlawful actions abating. Sadly, we see a humanitarian disaster unfolding. The conflict is claiming the lives of tens of thousands of civilians, upending livelihoods and inflicting long-lasting trauma, especially on children. A generation of young Ukrainians and Russians are perishing because of an ill-begotten war. Russia's war against Ukraine not only tears away at the fabric of the United Nations, it has shattered the sense of security, not just for the people of Ukraine, but also for its neighbors. The impact of the war has also been reverberating around the world, disrupting energy supplies and food security, exacerbating economic and social crises in other parts of the world. The flagrant violation of international norms and obligations, denying Ukrainian independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity must cease immediately. International humanitarian law, which clearly prohibits attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, must be adhered to at all times and by all parties. As a nation that knows all too well what it means to suffer from military aggression, Korea firmly believes that aggression must not go unanswered. As a nation all too familiar with the agonizing consequences of armed conflict, Korea has a profound sense of empathy with the plight of the Ukrainian people. That is why President Yoon Suk-yeol visited Ukraine last July and launched the Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative. Under this initiative, Korea has provided $140 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine, including demining equipment and emergency medical vehicles. Starting this year, we will provide a comprehensive aid package of $2.3 billion spread out over several years to help the Ukrainian people alleviate their suffering and rebuild their nation. We are also collaborating with international partners through the multi-agency donor coordination platform for Ukraine to ensure that our collective assistance is both effective and well coordinated. Madam President, my government is deeply troubled by the emerging military cooperation between Russia and North Korea. North Korean munitions and missiles have been sighted in Ukraine, which not only aggravates the human suffering, but also risks further escalating and prolonging the war in Ukraine. If and when it turns out to be the case that North Korea receives in return, whether advanced military technology or oil shipments exceeding limits under Security Council resolutions, this would redound to North Korea's ability to threaten security on the Korean Peninsula and beyond. Both dimensions of this nexus constitute unequivocal violations of multiple UN Security Council resolutions and undermine the global non-proliferation regime. We strongly urge Russia and North Korea to comply with the relevant Security Council resolutions, all of which were unanimously adopted in this chamber. Madam President, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine is heightening geopolitical tensions worldwide, presenting us with challenges of unprecedented magnitude. Therefore, it is imperative that the Security Council devise effective strategies to navigate these complexities, notwithstanding inherent shortcomings and current constraints, to fulfill its fundamental duty of maintaining international peace and security. and I wish to reaffirm Korea's commitment as a member of the Security Council to actively contribute to realizing this goal. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Teyu for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Linda Thomas Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States and member of President Biden's cabinet.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Secretary General Guterres, for your briefing, and thank you to Guyana for calling this important meeting. I welcome the many foreign ministers joining us today. Your presence reflects the importance that we accord this issue. 2 years ago, on a cold February evening, I gathered with many of you in this chamber. The United States and Albania had called a late-night emergency meeting because we feared Russia's invasion of Ukraine was imminent, and we were right. We'd been sounding the alarm for weeks. I'd informed the Council in no uncertain terms about the buildup of troops along the border with Ukraine. Secretary Blinken had come to the Security Council laying out in exacting detail our concerns that Russia would soon invade its sovereign neighbor. And then on February 24th, it did. While I and other members of this council called for diplomacy and de-escalation, President Putin openly chose war. Even as the Russian representative who was sitting in the president's chair denied it in this room, we could see the reality of Russia's brutal aggression unfolding in real time. The world could see that choice between violence and diplomacy, war and peace, unfolding in real time. Today, despite Putin's best efforts, the world continues to bear witness to Russian brutality, Russian hypocrisy, and Russian cruelty. Thanks to the unrelenting work of Ukrainian investigators and aid workers, fearless journalists, and numerous UN bodies, including this council, we have seen through the Kremlin lies. The lie that it was not Russian troops who illegally seized Crimea 10 years ago, a falsehood that when it suited him, Putin eventually admitted to. The lie that the transnational criminal organization of Wagner Group had no affiliation with the Kremlin. Of course, the widespread deployment of Wagner forces, as well as Putin's own admission that the Kremlin financed their work, proved otherwise. And of course, the lie that in the months leading up to Russia's invasion 2 years ago, Russia had no intention to further invade Ukraine, that the nearly 200,000 troops it assembled near the border were simply a military exercise. Through these lies, Putin has tried to rewrite history, to justify the unjustifiable, to break the will of the Ukrainian people and to break the will of the international community as we stand up for the United Nations Charter and its foundational principles of sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Colleagues, we cannot let that happen. Not when Russia continues to bomb grain silos, last destroying more than 300,000 tons of grain in a matter of months last year. Not when the Kremlin continues to detain political activists, journalists, opposition leaders, people like Alexei Navalny, who was killed for speaking truth to power about the authoritarian rot at the heart of Russia's government. Not when Russian forces have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in Ukraine, including summary executions, torture, and sexual violence. And not when hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian civilians have been deported to Russia or forcibly transferred within Russia-occupied territories of Ukraine. Babies as young as a few months old, whose Ukrainian identities Russia has stripped and whose futures they have permanently changed. The list of Russian violations and abuses could, unfortunately, go on and on. This senseless war has worsened a global food insecurity crisis, roiled the global energy market, caused incalculable damages to our environment, and undermined the global non-proliferation regime. For 2 years, President Putin has been hell-bent on beating Ukrainians into submission. And yet, in the face of so much cruelty, so much trauma, so much death and destruction, the Ukrainian people have not been cowed. they have fought back, and they've done so effectively. Vastly outnumbered, they have not only defended their land, but their freedoms, their democracy, and their identity. And they have shown the world that community is a form of resistance. I think about the people setting up makeshift schools and bomb shelters, the medical professionals nursing orphans back to health, and then hiding these babies from Russians hoping to take them. The workers I met at a grain processing facility in Kyiv, people who risked their lives to feed the hungriest among us. For 2 years, Ukrainians have stopped Putin's quest to conquer their country, strip it of its independence, and absorb it into Russia, and while fighting to keep the world fed and warm. And so as a global community, we must support Ukraine to help Ukraine fight not only for peace, but for a just, lasting peace, rooted in the UN's Charter's fundamental principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence, a peace that, time and time again, Russia has rejected in favor of violence, destruction, and unlawfulness. Because let's be exceedingly clear here. If Russia puts down its weapons today, the war would end. If Ukraine put down its weapons, Ukraine would be over. Only one party is the aggressor in this war, and only one party can end it. That was true 2 years ago when this body gathered on that cold February night as the world turned upside down, and it's true today. So amidst so many bald-faced lies hurled at us from this chamber and from Moscow, we continue to stand with the people of Ukraine. And we continue to demand that Russia put an end to its campaign of cruelty, that it withdraw its troops from Ukraine's internationally recognized border and return the children taken from their homes, that it cease its unlawful procurement of ballistic missiles, launchers, and other arms from DPRK in violation of Security Council resolutions, and that it meets its responsibility as a member of this council and uphold the charter we have all sworn to protect. Today, President Biden announced new sanctions against Russia for its ongoing war of aggression in Ukraine and for the death of Alexei Navalny. We need to hold Russia accountable so that we need not mark any more tragic milestones like this one today, so that the brave, resilient people of Ukraine can finally see a just and lasting peace. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Thomas Greenfield, for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Tsuji Kyoto, State Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing. 2 years ago, Russia started its brutal aggression against Ukraine. And I join you today to strongly condemn Russia for continuing this aggression and hostility right up to the present day. Madam President, we condemn in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine. This blatant violation of international law, including the UN Charter, cannot be justified. The sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine must be respected. This is not only a European issue, nor just an issue of the so-called Russia and the West. Any attempt to unilaterally change the status quo by force must not be tolerated anywhere in the world. Many civilians have lost their lives or been injured, and Russia's attacks on hospitals, schools, power plants, and other critical infrastructure are not just destroying the present lives of the Ukrainian people, but also threatening their future. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be upheld. All perpetrators of this atrocity must be held accountable. Russia's procurement of ballistic missiles from North Korea and their use against Ukraine is absolutely unacceptable. Any transfer of weapons or related equipment and technology, low quality, by the way, if I may add, between Russia and North Korea is a clear violation of relevant Security Council resolutions. And we're also deeply concerned about any possible transfer of nuclear and ballistic missile-related technology to North Korea. Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons is a serious and unacceptable menace to the peace and security of the international community. Madam President, we respect the efforts of many countries to seek peace. However, it is inappropriate to equate the aggressor and the victim, and to demand diplomatic efforts on both sides as if both sides are at fault. Japan reiterates that peace must be based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. In this regard, Japan supports President Zelensky's efforts to his peace formula. We must achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, which the overwhelming majority of the General Assembly and the Security Council has been calling for. We must uphold the international order based on the rule of law. Madam President, since my visit to Kyiv last November, I've been working hard to materialize the recovery and reconstruction of Ukraine. And on February 19th, Japan invited Prime Minister Shmyhal to Tokyo for the Japan-Ukraine Conference for promotion of economic growth and reconstruction. At the conference, we confirmed our intention to promote close public-private cooperation and agreed on the importance of medium to long-term support with consideration to women and children. Our public and private sectors will further support Ukraine, taking into account the country's needs. Madam President, we once again strongly urge Russia to cease its aggression and withdraw immediately and unconditionally from all internationally recognized territories of Ukraine. This, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, is a matter of principle. It is beyond politics. Therefore, Japan, with its allies and partners, will continue to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. Thank you.
His Excellency, Mr. Kyoto, for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank the Secretary General for his briefing. We have convened to mark 2 years since the Russian Federation launched its unprovoked and unjustified war of aggression against Ukraine. This war and its continuation is an affront to the UN Charter, the work of the Security Council, and the architecture of international peace and security. As members of this Council, we all have a collective responsibility to uphold the UN Charter. It is on us to further advance the implementation of the resolutions adopted by the General Assembly during its emergency special session on Ukraine. We must honor the calls of the Secretary General for diplomatic solutions. All these elements are critical to restoring international peace and security. Madam President, the number of civilian casualties in Ukraine significantly increased in December and January compared with previous months. OHCHR has verified that 158 civilians were killed and 48 injured solely in January. Since the beginning of this war, there has been over 30,000 civilian casualties and more than 14 million people in need of humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. The deportation and forced transfer of children is of particular concern. According to the Ukrainian National Information Bureau, over 19,000 children have been deported or forcibly displaced. In this regard, Malta recalls the Independent Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council, as well as the Secretary General's annual report on children in armed conflict, which shed a light on Russia's violations against children. The consequences of this conflict have also impacted women and girls. They have been disproportionately impacted, since they are at far greater risk of gender-based and conflict-related sexual abuse. Despite the horror and trauma that many have experienced over the past 24 months, Ukrainian women and girls have shown remarkable courage and resilience. Millions of them are playing a crucial role in providing humanitarian aid. Madam President, Malta is firmly committed to international law and the UN Charter. We therefore reaffirm our strong support towards all ongoing accountability processes. These include the important work of the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. Those responsible for the crimes committed in Ukraine must be held accountable. There can be no lasting peace without justice. We must also not forget that by terminating the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Russia has also taken the world's population hostage by blocking Ukrainian grain exports, all the while stealing grain from occupied Ukrainian territories and destroying Ukrainian grain facilities. In the face of this unilateral blockade, the EU has strengthened its support to Ukraine and to the global food security. The EU will keep on investing in the Solidarity Lanes Action Plan, which has allowed Ukraine to export 67 million tons of grain, oilseeds, and related products since May 2022. In closing, Madam President, Malta will continue to support all efforts to address the consequences of Russia's aggression. We also reiterate that the only step towards a just and lasting peace would be for Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and unconditionally, completely withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель,
Thank you, Madam President.
сегодняшнее заседание созвано
Today's
по
meeting,
инициативе ряда западных
convened at the
делегаций.
initiative
Это
of a number of
déjà vu.
Western states, is like déjà
Год
vu.
назад в этом же зале
A year ago in the
Мальтийское
same room,
председательство
the
собрало
Maltese
аналогичный
presidency
ритуальный спектакль по поводу годовщины начала нашей специальной военной операции, на который слетелись
to mark the one-year
европейские
anniversary
министры,
of
чтобы
our
зачитать под копирку
special military
написанный
operation,
по-российски
where
текст.
foreign ministers were brought together to read
Год назад
anti-Russian statement that was copied under dictation.
Год назад у
A year
западного
ago,
блока было модно
the Western
рекламировать
bloc,
свои псевдомирные инициативы,
was very much tried
которые,
to
по сути,
promote its
сводились к
peaceful
лукавому
initiatives, which in
орвелловскому
essence
оксюморону
were
«война — это
reduced to
мир».
the cunning statement from Orwell, war is peace.
При этом Запад откровенно
At the same
внушал
time, the
явно
West
не блещущему
openly
стратегическим мышлением
instilled in Zelensky,
опасную и
who was no
абсурдную
rocket
иллюзию о том, что
scientist when
при
it comes to
западной поддержке
strategic
он
thinking,
сможет
the
одержать
absurd
победу
illusion
над
that
Россией на поле
with
боя.
Western support he could defeat Russia on the field of battle.
Особенно старался некий господин из
Particularly
прекрасного
certain
сада, для
gentlemen
которого
from the
все, кто
wonderful
не
garden,
относится к золотому миллиарду,
try very
сорняки.
hard, for whom anyone who is not part of the golden billion are trash.
ЕС также по
The
Орвеллу
European
поставлял
Union
оружие
also,
киевскому режиму
following
на
Orwell,
деньги Фонда мира.
continued to supply weapons to the Kiev regime using the money from the Peace Fund.
С тех пор прошел еще один год.
Another year has passed since
Украина
then.
вдрызг провалила разрекламированное
Ukraine
ею
has
контрнаступление,
completely failed in
но
its
Запад все
loudly
равно
broadcast
продолжил накачку киевского
counteroffensive, and yet
режима
the
оружием,
West continues to pump the Kiev regime full of
поощряя его
weaponry,
бросать все больше жизни
encouraging
украинцев
it
в пламя
to throw
конфликта,
more and more lives of
который
Ukrainians in
США
the
уже,
flame of conflict,
отбросив
which
любые приличия,
the
стали
United States
называть
already
выгодным
setting aside
бизнес-проектом.
any decorum now calls a profitable business venture.
Настолько прибыльным он оказался
In
для
fact,
военно-промышленного комплекса.
that's because it's become so profitable for the military-industrial complex.
Параллельно настойчиво
In
продвигался некий
parallel, there's a
процесс по
stubborn
обсуждению
attempt to promote some
совершенно
kind of
тупиковой
process
псевдомирной
to
формулы,
discuss some kind of completely
на
dead-end
разнообразные сходки, в
pseudo-peace
рамках
formula
которого
at different
то в
meetups,
Копенгагене, то в Давосе всяческими
where either in Copenhagen or
ухищрениями
in
затаскивали
Davos,
страны
using various
глобального Юга и
tricks,
Востока,
countries from the global south and east were
чтобы
dragged
потом
into
выдать
these
это
events
за
in
широкую
order to
международную
then
поддержку.
Present this as a broad international
При
support.
этом очевидно, что
At the
страны
same time, it
мирового
is clear
большинства
that
прекрасно
the
видят
countries of the
реальную
global
подоплеку этих
majority
интриг
clearly see the real
и совершенно
background
не
of these
горят желанием
intrigues and
играть роль
have
статистов,
no wish to play the role of
равно как и
extras in
осознают,
them,
что без
just
России
as they
обсуждать
understand
что-либо
that
бессмысленно.
it's completely pointless to discuss anything
Что же
without
этот
the
год принес
participation
Украине?
of Russia. So what has this year brought for
Новые,
Ukraine?
исчисляемые сотнями тысяч бессмысленных
Hundreds of
жертв,
thousands senseless
назревающий
victims,
коллапс
a looming
экономики,
collapse of its
глубочайший кризис
economy, a
государственности,
deep crisis of its
так как для
statehood and
народа
governance.
Украины все очевиднее полная
Because for the
неспособность
people
и
of Ukraine, it's
несамостоятельность руководства.
increasingly clear how ineffective and how the ineffective its government and how much it lacks independence.
По уши увязнув в коррупции, оно не
Wallowing in
справляется даже с
corruption,
базовыми социальными
this
обязательствами,
government cannot even meet its
выбивая
basic
очень
social
безуспешно из западных доноров средства
obligations,
на выплату
while
пенсий
it
своим гражданам.
badgers Western donors without success for money to even pay their pensions to citizens.
Молодое, теперь уже и не молодое
The
поколение.
younger generation, and now already
Отлавливают
not so
на
young
улице, как
generation, is
скот, и
being
бросают в мясные
nabbed on the
штурмы,
streets
призванные
like
показать
animals, and
западным
then
спонсорам,
are
что их
thrown into
положение
meat
себя
grinder
окупает.
assaults in order to show to Western sponsors that their investments are bringing
Мы сегодня
returns.
услышали и еще
Today we
услышим много
heard and we will
пафосности.
hear many pompous statements.
Однако на самом деле
However,
Запад
in
заинтересован
fact,
совершенно
the
не в том,
West
чтобы
is
помочь Украине.
not interested at all in helping the Ukraine.
Западной
The
политики в
essence
отношении
of
Украины
Western
недавно откровенно
policy
суммировала главный
towards
редактор
Ukraine was
британского издания
recently
«Экономист»
summarized by the
Зенни
editor-in-chief
Минтон-Бедуэс.
of The Economist, Zeni Minton-Bedoues.
Она заявила в телеинтервью,
She
цитирую,
claimed in a television interview, and here I quote,
«Дать Украине деньги – это самый
giving
дешевый
money
способ
to
для
the Ukraine
Соединенных Штатов
is the
укрепить
cheapest
свою
way for the
безопасность».
United States to strengthen its
Это
security.
украинцы ведут бои,
Ukrainians are
это
fighting.
их убивают.
They're being killed.
США и Европа поставляют им
The
оружие.
United States and Europe are simply supplying them with weapons, and by doing this, we are pushing back against Putin. The end of quote.
Расплачиваясь за свои интересы жизнями сегодняшних туземцев,
By
украинцев,
paying
как
for
они
their
считают,
interests
Запад
with the
во главе
lives of
США в лучших
contemporary
неоколониальных
Aborigines, that is the
традициях
Ukrainians,
пытается решить свои
the West,
геополитические
headed
задачи
by the United
и не
States,
допустить
in the
того,
best new
чтобы
colonial
Вашингтон
traditions, is
потерял
trying to
присвоенную самому себе роль мирового гегемона.
find solutions to its
Или
geopolitical
чтобы в мире
tasks, and to
укрепились
make
другие
sure that
мощные и
Washington
самодостаточные.
doesn't lose its self-appointed role as the global
Как бы то ни
policeman,
было, сегодня
and
уже очевидно,
not to see other
что в этой войне по
powerful
доверенности
and
Соединенных
self-sufficient
Штатов,
poles
Евросоюза и НАТО против России руками
emerge in the
украинцев
world. Whatever happens,
Украина
it's become
проигрывает.
clear that in this proxy war, the United States, EU, and NATO against Russia by using the hands of the Ukrainians, Ukraine is losing.
И что не менее важно, как
And
бы
what is no
тяжело
less
ни было
important, no
принять
matter
этот
how
вывод нашим
difficult
европейским коллегам,
it'll be to accept this
Она не
conclusion for our
единственная
European
проигравшая от этого
colleagues,
конфликта.
Ukraine is not the only one
Едва
who
ли
is
не
losing
главный
from this
проигравший,
conflict.
это сам
Perhaps
Европейский
the
Союз.
most important loser is the European Union itself.
Хотел бы, пользуясь случаем,
Taking
обратиться
this
к представителям
opportunity,
стран
I'd like to
Евросоюза.
address the representatives of
Вы
the
так
European
долго
Union.
выстраивали европейский
You,
проект.
for such a long time,
Гордились
you
тем, что
built
вам
the European
удалось
project.
сформировать
You were
общую
proud that
внешнюю
you
политику,
managed
политику в области
to
безопасности.
mold common foreign policy and common security
Мы
policy.
помним те
We
времена, когда
remember
Евросоюз
the
лелеял
times when
планы
the
на
European
собственную
Union nurtured
геополитическую роль,
plans for its
имел
own
особое
independent
мнение по
geopolitical
целому ряду
role,
ключевых
had its own
международных проблем.
opinion for a whole range of key international issues.
Поражает, как легко
It's
вы расстались со
incredible
всеми
how
этими
quickly you've
амбициями,
given
по
up all
команде
these
вернувшись в
ambitions.
строй послушных сателлитов
As soon as
США.
the order came, you got back into line as obedient satellites of the United States.
Конфликт на
The
Украине, который
conflict
так
in
старательно
Ukraine,
подпитываете,
which
выгребая остатки
you are
из
so
европейских
diligently
арсеналов,
stoking by
обостряет
scraping the
миграционные проблемы
bottom
наших
of
стран.
the European arsenals for
Бьет
any
по вашей
remaining
энергетической
weaponry,
сфере.
is only worsening migration problems in your
Как мы
country
узнали на
and
этой
is
неделе,
undermining
прямые
your
потери
energy
одной только
sector.
Германии,
As we
считавшейся
learned this week,
ЕС,
the
от
direct
навязанных
losses
Соединенных
of
Штатов
just Germany, which is
российских
considered the
санкций,
locomotive
составили
of
как
the
минимум
EU,
200 миллиардов
due
долларов.
to the anti-Russian sanctions imposed by the United States, is at least $200 billion.
В чем тут, собственно, европейский
So,
интерес?
where is
Жаль,
the
что вы
European interest
забыли о
in
том,
this?
что
It's
Соединенные
unfortunate
Штаты и
that you have
Великобритания
forgotten
всегда
that
являлись
the U.S.
главными
and
бенефициарами любого конфликта
Great
на
Britain have
территории
always been
континентальной
the main
Европы
beneficiaries
и
of any
целенаправленно
conflict on the
разжигали
territory of
противоречия на этом
continental Europe. They
пространстве, чтобы
intentionally
не допустить
stoked
появления
conflicts in
еще
this
одного геополитического
region
конкурента.
so as not to allow for the
Объединенная
emergence of
Европа,
another
живущая в мире и
geopolitical
сотрудничестве
competitor.
со
That is
своим
a
соседом
unified Europe living in peace and cooperation with its neighbor Russia.
Вам последовательно, через проводивших американские интересы
through
младоевропейцев,
the
впрыскивали
efforts of new
русофобский яд и в
European
итоге
members who
полностью
are
отравили.
promoting EU interests, you've been introduced the poison of Russophobia.
И теперь вместо
And have been
стратегического
poisoned.
партнерства
And
и выгодных
today, instead
совместных
of strategic
экономических проектов,
partnership and
вы
mutually
рисуете
beneficial
Россию
economic
образ врага и
projects, you're
стреляете себе в
depicting
ногу,
Russia as an
якобы
enemy, and you're
освобождаясь от
shooting yourself in the foot
энергозависимости от
by
нашей страны
supposedly
и попадая
freeing
в еще
yourself from
более
energy
жесткую
dependency on our country,
энергозависимость от Соединенных
while
Штатов.
becoming even more
Более
dependent
того,
on
сегодня не только Украина, но и вся
falling
Европа
into
рискует
harsher
вновь стать
dependence on the
плацдармом
United
военного
States. Furthermore,
противостояния, в которое вас
not only Ukraine,
последовательно
but all
втягивают
of
из-за
Europe
океана.
risks becoming a theater of a military confrontation, which you're being drawn into from across the ocean.
Нужно ли это населению европейских стран?
Do the people of Europe really need this?
Хочется верить, что нет.
I'd like to believe that they don't.
Опрос общественного мнения, проведенный в
Opinion
январе в
polls
12
conducted in
европейских
January
странах,
in 12
показывают, что
European
только
countries
10%
show that only
европейцев верят, что
10% of
Украина
Europeans
может победить
believe
Россию.
that Ukraine can defeat Russia.
Бунтуют европейские фермеры,
European farmers are
не
rebelling.
желая потерять
They don't want to
сельскохозяйственные рынки
lose
из-за демпинга
agricultural
украинских
markets due
экспортеров.
to the dumping by Ukrainian exporters.
Широко разошлись кадры скандалов на
There's been widely
польско-украинской
viewed
границе, где
footage
польские
of
пограничники
scandals
отказываются пропускать
on the
украинских грузовики с
Polish-Ukrainian
зерном.
border, where Polish border guards
Очевидно,
refuse to
что
allow
никакое
Ukrainian
европейское
trucks with
будущее
grain. It's
на
clear
сквозь
that there will be
коррумпированной
no
криминальной
European
Украине с нищим
future
населением,
for the completely
которую ее
corrupt and
всесоюзные
criminalized Ukraine
жительницы
with its
превратило
dirt
нынешнее
poor
марионеточное
inhabitants.
руководство, теперь
A
не
country that was once the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, but has completely
Украине
been
с момента
destroyed by its
обретения
puppet
формальной
government.
независимости
Because
отводилась
Ukraine, since it
незавидная роль
became
антироссийского
formally
плацдарма.
independent, was to play the role of an anti-Russian bridgehead.
В 2004
In
году в ней состоялся,
2004,
по сути, первый
What occurred was the
срежиссированный Западом
first
антиконституционный
staged
переворот,
Western
который в итоге народ не
anti-constitutional
поддержал.
coup, which ultimately the
Тогда
people of Ukraine
Запад
did not
стал готовить
support.
переворот таким
Then the
образом,
West
чтобы больше
began
не было
to
осечек,
plan its
чтобы
coup in
навсегда
such a way that there would be
изничтожить
no more
патриотически
misfires, in
ориентированную
order to
оппозицию.
destroy once and for all the
Именно это
patriotically
и
oriented
происходит все
opposition.
годы
This is
после Майданного
precisely what has been
переворота
going on
2014
since the
года.
Maidan coup of 2014.
Приход к власти, спонсируемый
Now,
западными русофобами,
the
националистами и неонацистами в 2014
neo-nationalists
году
and neo-Nazis that came to power in 2014 with the support of the West, this represented a watershed in the recent history of Ukraine. The anti-constitutional coup d'etat, whose 10th year anniversary we're witnessing today, became possible as a result of an unconcealed interference into the internal affairs of this
Таким
country.
образом, было положено начало форсированному втягиванию
Spelled the
Киева в авантюрный
beginning
проект по
of
нанесению России
drawing
стратегического
Kiev into
поражения,
the dangerous
взят курс
gambles
на
meant to inflict a
игнорирование
strategic
интересов
defeat
и поправление
against Russia,
прав жителей
thus
Юго-Востока
taking the
страны.
path of ignoring the interests of its people and
Против тех, кто
trampling on the
стремился
rights
сохранить
of
свою идентичность,
the
свои
inhabitants
исторические
of the
культурные корни, была развязана
southeast.
жестокая и
These people
бесчеловечная,
merely
так
sought to preserve their
называемая
identity, their
антитеррористическая
historical
операция,
and cultural roots.
в ходе
Against them, a
которой
cruel
в
and
нарушение
inhumane
Конституции Украины
anti-terrorist
были задействованы
operation was
армия
launched.
и
During that
национальные
operation, in breach of the
националистические
Constitution of Ukraine, the army and national battalions were deployed.
националистические батальоны.
Nationalist battalions were deployed.
В Донбассе не было террористов,
There
что
were no
своим недавним
terrorists in the
решением
Donbass,
подтвердил
which was
Международный суд.
confirmed in its recent decision by the
Все это
International
привело
Court
к
of Justice. All
деградации
this
украинской
has led to the
государственности, дальнейшей
deterioration of
радикализации,
Ukrainian statehood,
росту
further
национализма и
radicalization,
многочисленным
growth in
жертвам среди
nationalism,
населения.
and multiple victims among the peaceful population.
Представитель британских
The
кукловодов
representative
киевского режима вопрошал в этом зале, не жалко ли
the
нам посылать
representative
воевать на Украину наших сынов.
The British stated that aren't
Вопрошал в этом зале, не жалко ли нам посылать воевать на Украину наших сынов.
asked us whether we fear or we regret sending our sons to fight in Ukraine.
Конечно, жалко.
Of course, we regret this very much.
Жалко и несчастных украинцев, которых посылают
We
умирать
also,
за геополитические интересы Запада.
We also pity the poor Ukrainians who are sent to die to further the interests of the West.
Вот только он, я имею в виду представитель Великобритании, в традиционной западной лицемерной манере умолчал о том,
Only the representative
что мы
of
делали это
Great
2 года
Britain
назад не для того, чтобы начать войну, а для того, чтобы ее остановить.
hypocritically forgot to mention that we did this. We sent our boys to fight 2 years ago, not to start a war, but to prevent a war,
To finish it.
to finish it, rather.
Остановить войну, которую
To end
8 лет
a war,
вел поддерживаемый
which
вами
was
режим
conducted
против
by
мирного населения
8
Донбасса.
years by a regime that was supported by you, a war against the Donbass.
Жертвами которой уже на тот момент стали более 14 тысяч человек.
By that time, already 14,000
Именно
people
это
had
стало
become
главной причиной
victims
начала
of that war.
специальной военной
That
операции.
was the main reason for the start of the special military
Что
operation.
касается вопроса о том, с кем мы
As
воюем на
far
Украине,
as the issue of who
то
we're
на
fighting
него
in
вы
Ukraine,
можете ответить сами,
well,
если
you can
вспомните,
answer that question
что
yourself
киевский
if you
режим
recall
почитает в
that the
качестве героев.
Kiev
Кого киевский
regime,
режим
who the
почитает
Kiev
в качестве
regime
героев?
extols as its heroes.
Кто такие, например, Бандера и
For
Шухевич,
example,
отряды которых
Bandera
вместе
and
с нацистами убили
Shukhevich,
сотни тысяч
whose
евреев, поляков,
their
русских, украинцев.
regiments and units, together with the SS and Nazis, killed
Спросите сегодня у
hundreds of
господина
thousands of
Сикорского,
Poles and Ukrainians.
который
Or
будет
ask
выступать
Mr.
позже.
Sikorsky, who
И он
will
вам
take the
расскажет
floor
про
later, and he'll tell
учиненную
you
украинской повстанческой армией Волынскую резню.
about the Volyn
И как её
massacre by
вспоминают
the
в Польше.
Ukrainian army and how it is remembered in Poland.
Мы считаем, что если лидеры
We
страны
believe that if
почитают
leaders of a
нацистов,
country
говорят как
glorify
нацисты и допускают
Nazis,
демонстрацию
speak like
нацистской
Nazis,
символики,
and allow for the
то они нацисты.
demonstrations using Nazi
А вы просто слишком малодушны,
symbols,
избирательны,
they
слепы,
are
чтобы это
Nazis.
всё
You are
признавать.
simply too cowardly and too myopic to acknowledge
Опять-таки,
all
пользуясь
this.
присутствием
Once
на
again,
сегодняшнем участием в
using
сегодняшнем заседании
the
господина Сежурне и
presence of
господина
Mr.
Камерона,
Sejourné and
сейчас
Mr.
нет в зале.
Cameron today, who left the room.
Их, правда, сейчас нет в зале.
Unfortunately, neither of them is in the room
Я
now.
хочу поднять
I
еще
would
одну
like
крайне
to
неудобную
raise another
с
quite
некоторых пор для наших
uncomfortable,
западных коллег.
has been
Минские соглашения.
uncomfortable issue for our Western colleagues. That is
Около
the
года назад
Minsk
мы все
agreements. About a
услышали
year ago, we
признание
all
Петра
heard the
Порошенко,
admission
Франсуа
of Petro
Олланда,
Poroshenko,
Ангелы Меркель,
François
а
Hollande,
также
Angela
Бориса
Merkel,
Джонсона
as
о
well
том,
as Boris
что
Johnson,
ни Франция, ни
about the fact
Германия,
that neither
ни та же
France nor Germany,
Великобритания
not even Great
никогда не
Britain,
воспринимали эти
never
договоренности всерьез,
took
не собирались
these agreements
подталкивать украинские
seriously,
власти к их
and they
выполнению.
did not
И лишь
intend to encourage
использовали
the
для того,
Ukrainian
чтобы
authorities to
затянуть время
fulfill
и
them. They
дать Киеву
simply
время
used them to give
на
Kiev
подготовку
time
войны с
to
Россией.
prepare for war with Russia.
Это была, по сути,
This,
явка с повинной
in
лидеров
essence,
этих
was an
государств,
admission of guilt
открыто и
by the
даже с
leaders of the
гордостью,
states, openly and even
признавших факт
proudly
умышленного нарушения
acknowledging
ими
how
резолюции
they
Совета
intentionally
Безопасности 2202, которая закрепила Минские договоренности.
violated Resolution 2202 of the
Но это
Security
не
Council,
мешает
which endorsed the
представителям
Minsk
этих же
agreements. That
государств,
does
как ни в
not
чем не
prevent
бывало,
the
сегодня
representatives of these
выступать в
states,
Совете
as
с
though none of
нотациями
that
в адрес
happened,
других членов,
to
рассуждать о
speak today
важности
with lectures
соблюдения
and
международного
lecture
плана
other members
и
about
обвинять
the
другие
importance
страны в невыполнении резолюции Совета Безопасности.
complying with international law and violating resolutions of the Security Council.
Точнее, они призывают к соблюдению международного
Rather, they
порядка,
call
основанного на
for the
правилах.
respect of an international rules-based order.
Правилах,
Based on
ими же и для
rules
своей выгоды
which
изобретены.
they themselves invented for their own benefit.
Все эти годы, с момента
All these
подписания
years
Минских
since the
соглашений,
signature of the
киевский
Minsk
режим
agreements, the
продолжал
Kiev
военные
regime
приготовления,
continued its military
укреплял боевой
preparation,
потенциал
strengthening its
ВСУ,
military potential.
активизировал
The Ukrainian armed
военно-техническое
forces
сотрудничество с
stepped
иностранными
up its
государствами.
military cooperation with
Только
foreign
после того,
states.
как все попытки добиться от
Only
украинской стороны,
after all
а также
attempts to
покрывающего его
convince
Запада,
the Ukrainians to as well as its Western sponsors,
добросовестного и
to
последовательного
implement
выполнения
in good faith
основополагающего
and fully
для
the
урегулирования внутриукраинского
fundamental
кризиса
document
документа
for resolving the
комплекса
Ukrainian
мер по выполнению
conflict, the
Минских
package of
соглашений
measures
оказались
of Minsk
тщетными,
agreements. Only
было
once all these
принято решение
attempts
о начале
proved to be in
специальной
vain
военной операции для
was the
защиты
decision made to
жителей
begin a
Донбасса в
special
соответствии
military
со
operation to
151
protect the
уставом.
lives of the inhabitants of Donbass in accordance with
Госпожа председатель,
Article
сегодня моя
51 of the
американская
UN Charter.
коллега,
Madam President,
пытаясь
today
найти
our
новые поводы
American
для нападок
colleague
на Россию, только что
trying to
упомянула
find
про
new reasons to criticize or to attack
что
Russia.
определенные что про осужденного за реальные уголовные преступления
That
Алексея Навального,
Alexei
умершего в
Navalny,
тюрьме
who
по
was
естественным причинам.
convicted based
Можете ли вы ответить,
on
за что
actual
киевский режим
accusations,
замучил до смерти
died in
американского
prison?
журналиста Гонсало
Can you
Лиру,
tell me
для спасения
then
которого ни вы,
for
ни
what
ваши
reason
руководители не сделали
the
ничего?
Ukrainian regime
Вы стыдливо
killed Gonzalo Lira
умалчиваете и
in
других
prison?
преступлений
You didn't do
киевского
anything
режима,
to
предпочитая
prevent
валять
that. You didn't
военную
mention anything of that or any of the other crimes
Уважаемые коллеги,
committed by the Kiev regime.
любой
Distinguished
конфликт рано
colleagues,
или поздно
any
заканчивается.
conflict ends
То же
sooner
самое,
or
мы уверены,
later.
ожидает и конфликт на Украине.
There's no doubt that the
Безусловно,
Ukrainian
чем
conflict
дольше он
will end as well.
затягивается,
There's no doubt
из-за
that the
западной
longer it lasts,
подпитки
due to
Киева,
the
тем более
sustained
невыгодными будут
support
условия мира
by
для Украины.
the West, the less advantageous will be the
перспективе
peace conditions for
принципиальное
Ukraine.
значение приобретет то,
In the
какие
long run, what
выводы
will
для
be
себя сделает
important
Западный мир.
is what kind of conclusions the
Будет ли он
West will draw from
самоубийственным
this.
упорством
Will it
навязывать
continue
остальному
with
миру свой
suicidal
однобокий порядок,
stubbornness to
основанный на
impose on the
правилах,
rest of the
пытаться
world its
разделить мир на
one-sided
сателлиты и
rules-based
врагов,
order,
либо
trying
все
to
же
divide the
включиться в
world into
осмысленный диалог
satellites
по
and
поиску
enemies,
способов
or will it
выстраивания
engage in
подлинно
meaningful
справедливого
dialogue to
порядка,
find a way
где
to
будут
build a
гарантированы
truly
интересы
just
всех
world order
государств.
where the interests of all states will be
Пока
guaranteed?
приходится, с сожалением,
For now, now we have to note with regret that Europe is in the throes of strategic blindness. It sees architecture of Euro-Atlantic security through the sight of a weapon, fueling its own fears about the Russian threat against which it needs to defend itself, while denying to Russia its own legitimate defense interests. This is a short-sighted and flawed approach which undermines the basic principles of the indivisibility of security. You're stoking laughable fears about the supposed upcoming aggression of Russia against European countries. Perhaps you have forgotten that it was European states at different historical periods, Poland, Sweden, France, Germany, and a whole range of its satellites, almost all of Europe during World War II, attacked the Russian state with remarkable single-mindedness, trying to defeat it, and always unsuccessfully. The United States tried to do the same thing during the Cold War. It's well known the disreputable role of Great Britain. Its diplomacy was always sophisticated in pitting countries against each other, pitting nations against each other, and continues to do so. The Russian statehood was shaped in conditions of constant external threats. Our peace-loving Western colleagues don't like to remember the fact that it was Russia who always had to beat back aggressions. But our people remember that very well. We know that this anti-Russian propaganda against the mythical Russian threat is believed less and less by the public in Western countries. That is why it is being wrapped up in layers of lies in order to not allow the truth through. But it has gotten through anyway, thanks to the efforts of those who understand what the world risks by continued confrontation. When there are such information breakthroughs, such as the one that took place during the interview by the American journalist Tucker Carlson, whose interview with the president of Russia opened the eyes of millions around the world. Now, beyond today's moment, it increasingly becomes necessary to discuss a fair and indivisible system of Euro-Atlantic security. In its current distorted version, it only is in the interest of the United States and its allies in NATO, which adopted the right to interfere in international affairs and into international affairs of other states. Western leaders fooled us during the years of the Cold War and want to continue to fool us now. They consider the rights of NATO to continue to expand as an absolute right, and transforming any corner of the world into the area of responsibility of the alliance. I want to just recall that Russia proposed a substantive dialogue on security guarantees at the end of 2021 and put forward specific proposals to the U.S. and NATO, but they were arrogantly rejected. The result was a new hot conflict in Europe. The West left us no choice. We were forced to defend our people and our future. At the same time, we never refused negotiations. The Kiev regime itself refused itself to engage in negotiations. I want to stress it is still possible to maintain Ukraine in some kind of form, but it must be a peaceful, neutral Ukraine with which there are no discriminations or Russophobia, and where Nazi criminals are not glorified, and which does not represent a threat to Russia. That is the goal of our special military operation. This is why the choice by the collective West will be necessary. They will need to find some common sense in order to save something from Ukraine.
Of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I thank Secretary General Mr. Guterres for his earlier briefing. The ongoing Ukraine crisis is threatening to become a protracted, compounded, and wider one. This tragedy that could have been avoided has become what it is today. This is both distressing and worthy of deep reflection. The international community should pull together in the search for a just and sensible solution to settle the crisis politically and let peace prevail as soon as possible. First, efforts should remain focused on a political settlement. The Ukraine crisis has caused incalculable damage. The most pressing priority of the hour is to stop hostilities, launch peace talks, and restore peace. Peace is in the interest of all parties. The sooner peace talks begin, the less the damage that is done. any action that is conducive to peace and greater trust, however small it may seem, is worth our bona fide effort as long as there is a glimmer of hope. We call upon the parties concerned to show a sense of responsibility and make constructive diplomatic efforts to promote the de-escalation and détente. It is favorable conditions for the resumption of negotiations they should be creating, not man-made obstacles to make peace harder to achieve, much less to supply weapons, stoke the fire and pour oil on it, and to profit from the prolonged crisis. We look forward to greater efforts by the UN to promote peace talks and alleviate the humanitarian situation. Second, we must stay the course towards common security, which is our overarching goal. In the face of complexities and challenges, we must be firmly committed to the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security. We must respect the legitimate security concerns of all countries and never lose sight of the fact that security is indivisible, that one country's security cannot be compromised at the expense of other countries' security, and that regional security cannot be guaranteed by strengthening or even expanding a military bloc. The legitimate security interests and concerns of all countries should be taken seriously and addressed properly. It must be pointed out that the situation that Europe is facing today is closely related to the repeated eastward expansion of NATO since the end of the Cold War. We encourage NATO to do some soul-searching, come out of the cage of Cold War mentality, and refrain from acting as an agent of troubles, instigating bloc confrontation. We urge the head of NATO to look at the world through an objective lens, stop saber-rattling, and do that which is genuinely conducive to world peace. Third, the spillover effects of the crisis must be proactively managed. The world is in enough turmoil as it is. It cannot afford to be hit by more crises that are bigger than what we already have. Attempting to solve problems by creating more problems doesn't work. Certain countries using the Ukraine crisis as a pretext has indiscriminately imposed unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction and have exerted unjustified pressure on the businesses of other countries, which have adversely impacted the global industrial chain, supply chain, and disrupted the order of global trade. The world economy is interdependent, and it is wrong to instrumentalize or weaponize the world economy. China firmly opposes the unlawful sanctions imposed on Chinese companies by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union using the Ukraine issue as their excuse. China will continue to take necessary measures to safeguard the legitimate rights and interests of Chinese enterprises and citizens. Fourth, we must actively advocate the equitable and orderly multipolarization of the world. The Cold War ended over 30 years ago. Since then, the international landscape has undergone profound adjustments, and the multipolarization of the world has picked up pace. This is the trend of our times, the tide of history. Humanity is a community with a shared future. All countries, large and small, are equal members of the global community when it comes to international relations and are entitled to a place on the international arena. All countries should jointly abide by the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, adhere to the universally accepted basic norms governing international relations, and practice genuine multilateralism together without selective application or double standards. For the world to slide back to the colonial age is not an option. International affairs should not be monopolized by a minority of countries trying to obstruct other countries' progress through hegemony and bullying is not right, and it won't work. On the other hand, major countries have a special responsibility for world peace and security and must conduct their relations responsibly and manage their differences properly in pursuit of win-win cooperation. Madam President, China played no part in the creation of the Ukraine crisis, nor is China a party to the crisis itself. we have not been watching the inferno from across the river, much less cashing in on the crisis. On the question of Ukraine, China has always maintained that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected, the purposes and principles of the UN Charter observed, the legitimate security concerns of all countries given due regard, and all efforts conducive to the peaceful resolution of the crisis supported. China's constructive role and unremitting efforts towards a political settlement of the Ukraine issue will continue. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President.
Empiezo por agradecer al secretario general por su intervención y sus incansables esfuerzos por la paz. Reconozco la presencia de las altas autoridades que han estado presentes en esta Cámara. Han pasado exactamente 729 días desde que inició la agresión militar rusa a Ucrania, en clara violación de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y del derecho internacional. El Ecuador recuerda con pesar la sesión de emergencia mantenida por este órgano la noche del 23 de febrero del 2022, pues en la misma se confirmarían las acciones injustificables que atentaron contra la soberanía y la integridad territorial de Ucrania. En estos 2 años hemos sido testigos de la devastación que el conflicto ha infligido al pueblo ucraniano, junto con sus repercusiones negativas en el ámbito global. Ha perturbado economías, comprometido la seguridad energética y agravado la inseguridad alimentaria a nivel mundial. La tierra fértil que durante siglos ha nutrido a millones de personas alrededor del planeta, hoy se encuentra asolada por la contaminación, los bombardeos y las minas. Esta guerra ha desencadenado una crisis humanitaria inconmensurable, con miles de vidas perdidas, entre ellos cientos de niños, además de millones de personas desplazadas. A esto se suman los daños devastadores en infraestructura crítica, energética, residencial, sanitaria, educativa, productiva, religiosa y cultural en Ucrania. Los ataques en zonas pobladas representan una de las facetas más trágicas y condenables del conflicto. Han causado muertes indiscriminadas y sufrimiento a civiles. El impacto psicológico y el trauma de vivir bajo constante amenaza afectará negativamente a varias generaciones. Reconocemos la labor incansable de los organismos humanitarios que trabajan para aliviar el sufrimiento de la población civil. Sin embargo, la magnitud de la crisis requiere una respuesta más amplia que asegure una asistencia humanitaria inmediata y que considere además las necesidades de reconstrucción del país. Al Ecuador le preocupa el peligro que suponen los ataques en los alrededores de las instalaciones nucleares. Por ello, reitero la necesidad de cumplir con los 7 pilares de seguridad nuclear y confirmo el apoyo de mi país a las tareas realizadas por el Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica y al cumplimiento de los 5 principios fundamentales para garantizar la seguridad en la planta de Zaporizhia. Me pregunto, ¿cuántas sesiones de este Consejo serán necesarias para que se cumplan las obligaciones estipuladas en la Carta de las Naciones Unidas y el derecho internacional, incluido el derecho internacional humanitario? Señora Presidenta, a pesar de los amplios esfuerzos de movilización por parte del sistema de las Naciones Unidas, el multilateralismo se ha visto sometido a una prueba de fuego, obligándonos a reflexionar sobre la eficacia de nuestras herramientas y mecanismos para prevenir y responder a las crisis. Si bien un veto impuesto el 25 de febrero del 2022 impidió que el Consejo de Seguridad actúe decisivamente, este no logró impedir que la Asamblea General
cannot keep the General Assembly from speaking out loud and clear.
En el marco del 11º periodo
During
extraordinario de
the
sesiones de
11th
emergencia,
emergency special
esa
session,
Asamblea
this
adoptó
Assembly
6
has adopted
resoluciones
6
que, entre otras
resolutions
cosas,
over all of those
reafirmaron su
emergency
compromiso
sessions,
con la
which
soberanía
inter
e integridad
reaffirm our
territorial de
commitment to
Ucrania,
the sovereignty and territorial
pidieron un
integrity of
cese a las
Ukraine, have
hostilidades
called for a
y
cessation of
reiteraron la
hostilities,
existencia que la
and have
Federación Rusa
reiterated the need for the Russian
retire de
Federation to
inmediato,
withdraw
por completo y sin
immediately,
condiciones,
completely, and without
todas sus
condition
fuerzas
all
militares
its
del
military
territorio de
forces
Ucrania.
from Ukrainian territory.
De igual manera,
Similarly,
con la declaración de la
with
presidencia del
the
6 de mayo del
presidential statement
2022,
on the 6th of May
este Consejo se mostró
2022, this
unido al
Council
expresar su
stood as
profunda
one in
preocupación
expressing its
por la
great
paz y
concern
la seguridad en
about peace and
Ucrania
security
y
in
reconoció
Ukraine,
que,
and it recognized
en virtud de la
that
Carta,
pursuant to the
todos los
Charter,
Estados miembros
all
han
member
asumido
states
la
are
obligación de
required
arreglar sus
to settle
controversias
their
internacionales
international
por
disputes
medios
by peaceful
pacíficos.
means.
Señora Presidenta,
Madam President,
el llamado del Secretario General a dar una
the
oportunidad a la paz
Secretary General's
es
appeal
un
to
eco de
give
nuestro
peace a
anhelo
chance
común.
echoes our common desire.
Luego de 2 años de
After
iniciada la
2
invasión
years
y varios más de
following the
devastación y
invasion and many
sufrimiento
more
para las poblaciones
incursions
del este
causing
de Ucrania,
devastation and suffering for
es
people in the
momento de
east of
retornar
Ukraine,
a la
it is
mesa
time
de
to return to the
negociaciones.
negotiating table.
Instamos
We
a
urge
todas las
all
partes
parties
implicadas
involved
a
to
considerar de
consider,
buena fe
in good faith,
todas las posibilidades
all
conducentes a una
options
solución
conducive
pacífica de
to a
controversias.
peaceful settlement of this dispute.
Transitamos tiempos de
We
incertidumbre,
are living in uncertain
donde las
times
tensiones
where
geopolíticas se
geopolitical
agudizan en
tensions
diversos
have
puntos del
heightened
globo.
in various parts of the
La
globe.
posibilidad
The
de una escalada
possibility
hacia un
of an
conflicto
escalation
global
towards a global
representa
conflict
la amenaza más
is
grave
the
para
most
nuestra
serious
existencia.
threat to our existence.
La carrera
The
armamentística,
arms race,
lejos de haberse
far from
detenido,
slowing down,
se acelera.
has sped up.
La agresión militar contra
Military
Ucrania
aggression
es
against
una tragedia
Ukraine
para los previos
is
de
a
Rusia
tragedy for the
Ucrania.
people of Russia and
y por
Ukraine,
tanto
and therefore
debe terminar
must end.
y debe terminar ya.
It must end
El
now.
Ecuador, fiel a sus
Ecuador,
principios históricos,
faithful
reitera
to its historic
con
principles,
solidaridad su
reiterates
solidaridad con la
its
soberanía e
solidarity
integridad
with the
territorial de
sovereignty and
Ucrania,
territorial integrity of
e
Ukraine.
insiste en el llamado a la
And
Federación
we
Rusa
also reiterate the
a que
appeal
suspenda sus
to the Russian
operaciones
Federation to
militares,
suspend its military
conforme le fue
operations
ordenado por la
as
Corte
called for by
Internacional de
the
Justicia el
ICJ
16 de
on the
marzo del
16th of March
2022,
2022,
de manera que se pueda
so
avanzar
that
sin más demora
immediate
hacia una paz
progress
justa y
can be made
duradera
towards just and
basada en el
lasting
derecho
peace based
internacional
on
y
international
los
law
principios
and on the
de la Carta de las
principles
Naciones Unidas.
of the United Nations
Muchas gracias.
Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, Mozambique thanks the presidency of Guyana for convening this meeting. We are grateful to the Secretary General for his insightful statement. We highly commend his complete devotion in promoting peace and security worldwide and in urging all member states to uphold the purposes and principles of the Charter of our organization and the tenets of international law. Madam President, as we mark the 2-year milestone since February 2022, when the conflict between Russia and Ukraine intensified into a larger scale war, the ensuing global distress and instability have had a profound and far-reaching impact that cannot be overstated. The conflict has injected a profound sense of uncertainty and turmoil into the heart of Europe. It has severely strained an international system already grappling with numerous fault lines and challenges across all continents. Despite the substantial resources allocated by this Council to address the issue, the conflict appears to be veering towards a gloomy direction with the severity of consequences escalating ominously. In light of the severe humanitarian, political, and economic consequences of the conflict, coupled with the genuine risk of a nuclear deflagration by accident, miscalculation, or otherwise, we believe a significant course adjustment is necessary, with the diplomacy assuming a central role. It is our understanding that for diplomacy to bear fruit, all parties must overcome the limitations of the current approach based solely on confrontation and use of force. In this context, it is our collective duty as representatives of our states to strongly encourage a negotiated settlement of the conflict in accordance with the charter that guides our organization. As we navigate through bloody conflicts in Africa, Middle East, and Asia, it is crucial that we bear in mind the interconnected nature of global peace and security. We do believe peace and security are indivisible and are of interest to the entire humankind. Madam President, we remain convinced and have consistently maintained that responsible and genuine dialogue is the only viable means to resolve this conflict. Against this background, Mozambique firmly advocates a political and negotiated solution as the most viable way to end the conflict. This is the solid path for a lasting and sustainable peace between the two sister countries and the two neighboring countries. To achieve this, we urge the parties to cease hostilities without delay, to resume direct negotiations without preconditions, and engage in dialogue in good faith. The cause of peace compels us that we encourage the parties to return to the negotiating table and embrace the imperfections of a compromise in the name of peace and security in Ukraine, in Europe, and in the world. Mozambique will always support every effort towards silencing the guns in Ukraine. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you for convening this meeting. My thanks go also to the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his insightful briefing. 2 years have passed since the crisis in Ukraine started, and hopes of reaching sustaining peace remain unattainable. The continuing deterioration of the humanitarian situation and the impact of the ongoing hostilities on civilians are a source of serious concern for Algeria, who had very friendly relations with both countries. The loss of civilian lives, the suffering of refugees and internally displaced persons caused by this conflict are profoundly worrying. critical infrastructure, such as energy facilities and agri-food system, were heavily impacted, with significant consequences felt worldwide, notably in Africa and developing countries. In the face of these challenges, the Council, whose primary responsibility is the maintenance of international peace and security, failed to pave the way for any consensual way out to the crisis. From day one at this Council, we have repeatedly expressed our concern about all the violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. We often stressed that continued escalation is neither beneficial nor granting peace to any of the parties. The polarization is only exacerbating tensions and jeopardizing prospects for sustainable peace. Madam President, today I would like to focus on what we didn't witness during these 2 years, or I should say what we wish to see in the nearest future. First, it is high time to deploy the necessary diplomatic effort to achieve de-escalation of tension between the parties so that we can put an end as soon as possible to the loss of lives and people suffering. Second, the concerned parties must show their willingness and readiness to engage in an inclusive and constructive dialogue. The two parties need to be guided by the spirit of good faith and without preconditions towards a peaceful settlement of this dispute within the implementation of the international law and the international humanitarian law. Third, we urge the parties to agree on a just and a lasting peace based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and their legitimate security concerns. 4, we emphasize the need to ensure a more coordinated and harmonized diplomatic action among the international community. The noble objective here will be to bring together the concerned parties and guarantee a more efficient and comprehensive diplomatic process to end this crisis. Obviously, political will is key to achieve tangible progress and mutually acceptable solution. Equally important is the consistency of this Council in upholding its responsibility in the protection of civilians, implementing the international humanitarian law and the principles and purposes of the UN Charter. Yes, all the pillars of the Charter. For its part, Algeria will remain actively engaged in the Security Council to promote a peaceful and a political solution to this crisis. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, I thank you for convening this briefing. I also thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his very informative briefing. Tomorrow, the 24th of February 2024, will mark exactly 2 years since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. The war has had profound repercussions that have gone beyond regional boundaries. This conflict has been protracted to the extent that the prospects for a peaceful settlement between Russia and Ukraine remains elusive, with both countries continuing to rely on military means to influence the war's outcome. There is thus a seeming stalemate with devastating consequences for civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and far-reaching effects on the geopolitical landscape and global economy. In the 2 years of the brutal conflict, more than 47,000 incidents involving armed clashes, airstrikes, and other attacks occurred across Ukraine in 2023 alone. These incidents caused increased civilian deaths, widespread damage, and destruction of homes, schools, hospitals, and other vital civil infrastructure, including energy. The cost of the conflict has been excessively high. According to the OHCHR, civilian casualties in Ukraine have exceeded 30,000, with over 10,000 killed and 19,000 injured since the full-scale conflict. It is believed that the actual figures are considerably higher. The International Organization for Migration has reported that the destruction of residential buildings has left nearly 720,000 people in the worst-affected parts of Ukraine with no access to adequate and safe housing. In Kherson Oblast, for example, nearly 30% of people live in damaged buildings. Access to education remains highly constrained, with almost half of all educational institutions damaged or destroyed in Kharkiv and Kherson, and the staggering 80% in Donetsk, according to the Ministry of Education and humanitarian partners. Access to health has also been impacted, with over 1,500 attacks on healthcare facilities verified by the WHO since February 2022. Nearly half of health centers are now rendered non-functional in some parts of the East and South. Sierra Leone condemns all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, and emphasize that these attacks are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to comply with applicable international law, in particular, international humanitarian law. Madam President, the distressing attack against civilians and civilian infrastructure have caused the fastest growing and largest displacement crisis in Europe. The UNHCR approximates that 10 million people have been forcibly displaced by the war as at last month, including 3.7 million internally displaced people and 6.3 million refugees who have fled Ukraine for abroad. As at the end of 2023, 5.9 million refugees from Ukraine were recorded across Europe. OCHA estimates that there are now over 14.6 million people in dire need of humanitarian assistance, including the approximately 10 million forcibly displaced people. About 3.3 million people living in frontline communities are grappling with severe shortages of resources and constant bombardment. Children have not been spared from the brunt and brutality of the conflict. Allegations of gross violation of the protection measures for children during armed conflicts have been reported. Destruction of healthcare facilities have exposed millions to increased trauma and mental health issues and impacted children's well-being. Additionally, the attacks on schools have had a significant impact on educational activities. Reportedly across the country, only 1/3 of children are attending classes entirely in person, while 1/3 are learning through a mixed in-person and online approach, and another 1/3 are fully learning online. In view of the above, Sierra Leone commends humanitarian aid agencies for considerably expanding the humanitarian operations over the past 2 years to respond to the growing and deteriorating needs that follow the escalation of the conflict. As hostilities along the front line continue to hamper humanitarian organizations' ability to deliver aid and services to people impacted by the conflict, Sierra Leone urges parties to the conflict to allow unhindered access of humanitarian personnel to people in dire need. Madam President, the economic ramifications of the war have been keenly felt across the global landscape, particularly in the food and energy markets, trade dynamics, and supply chain disruptions. These disruptions have contributed to price hikes and supply shortages that have reverberated across sectors reliant on stable market prices. In view of the economic challenges, Sierra Leone emphasizes the importance of the resolution of the conflict to enable the recovery and stabilization of not only the region, but the wider world. By supporting efforts to stabilize energy markets, restore trade networks, and provide economic assistance to affected populations, we can mitigate the economic impact of the conflict and pave the way for sustainable economic growth and development in the region and beyond. Moreover, the conflict has strained global political and economic relations and heightened geopolitical tensions, with serious implications for international cooperation on critical socio-economic and development issues, in addition to the maintenance of international peace and security. The erosion of trust and cooperation between nations has also exacerbated critical global issues such as arms control, nuclear proliferation, cybersecurity, and trade agreements, posing additional challenges for the maintenance of international peace and security. As we navigate the complexities of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its multidimensional global repercussions, Sierra Leone once more calls for good faith diplomatic efforts in pursuit of a peaceful resolution. Meaningful steps must be taken towards immediate cessation of the hostilities and parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. Let me close, Madam President, by noting that based on our unwavering principled view on the sacrosanct nature of the UN Charter, principles of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of member states, we once more reiterate our call for the full respect of the national sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. Secretary General, I thank you for your briefing and indeed for all you do in trying to forge peace in our world. I also wish to acknowledge the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, all other ministers and high-level officials joining this meeting. Tomorrow will mark exactly 2 years since Russian military forces invaded the territory of Ukraine in what was then termed a special military operation, an action that has cost the lives of over 10,000 civilians, injured many more, and displaced over 6 million Ukrainians. The toll on civilians in both Ukraine and Russia, including women, children, the elderly, and persons living with disabilities, is exceedingly high, with no immediate end in sight. Excellencies, Russia's invasion of Ukraine 2 years ago violated the most basic tenets of the United Nations Charter and the principles of respect for territorial integrity, sovereignty, and non-interference. Our countries have all felt the impact of this war to some degree, not only in terms of increased challenges to the rules-based order as we know it, anchored in the Charter and international law, but also in terms of disruptions in food and energy prices, logistics and supply chains, and worsening hunger in the most vulnerable regions of the globe, already struggling amidst COVID-19 recovery efforts. As a small developing state whose sovereignty and territorial integrity are protected by legal norms and instruments, Guyana deplores the threat or use of force in the conduct of international relations and condemns the military aggression that has been unleashed against the people of Ukraine. We reiterate our call for an immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to diplomacy. War must never be the answer. Instead, dialogue and diplomacy are the only guarantees of achieving lasting peace. While we welcome and recognize the efforts of some UN member states to find a diplomatic solution, we encourage greater investments in this regard. We call on the parties to respect the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality, and to fully comply with their legal obligations, including under the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. It is regrettable that this Council, which has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, is still unable to find a meaningful solution to end the conflict and to minimize the full impact of the war on the erosion of international norms. We repeat our call for the complete withdrawal of Russian military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, and urge the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict. We also urge strengthened efforts at all levels by all concerned parties toward a peaceful resolution. Guyana stands ready to work with members of this Council, and in fact everyone, to bring the war in Ukraine to a peaceful end and to find a sustainable solution for long-lasting peace. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Thank you, Madam President. As we discuss the war and peace talks and negotiations, here today there is another air raid on Ukraine taking place right now. And a residential building in Odessa was hit less than an hour ago. 2 civilians are heavily wounded, delivered to the hospital. And I'm afraid that someone is going to die in Ukraine before this meeting is adjourned. Because talking about negotiations is one thing, but throwing more drones and missiles on Ukraine, as Russia does every day, is completely another thing. But first of all, allow me to thank Secretary General for his attendance and his briefing, and also, of course, my thanks go to Guyanese presidency for convening us today. 2 years since Russia started its full-scale military invasion, 10 years since it started its aggression by attempting to annex Ukrainian Crimea and launching war in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. Today, Russia's name is synonymous with aggression, war, crimes, and barbarism. Its ugly face is the direct result of its impunity, stemming first and foremost from its presence in this chamber's seat. This is the seat of the Soviet Union, a state that does not exist anymore, and it has never been legally transferred to the Russian Federation. This is an example of how a small fraud led to a global catastrophe. We continue to insist that Russia has no legal right to be present at this table, and the future reform should correct this historic mistake that led to deadly consequences.